So not necessarily the folks who are going to be applying, but hopefully you'll be communicating with those who will and or sharing this information with others. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to get ready to share my screen right now. So hang on for just a moment. Okay. So we will go ahead and move right along. So once again, you're in the right place if you're here to talk about VCAP or the Vermont COVID-19 Agriculture Assistance Program. This specifically is the conversation about the dairy assistance application. And before we keep moving, I'm going to turn off my video because I've had some resolution issues. So hopefully you will just only see the presentation from here on out. So VCAP is the term for all of the funding programs that are happening, the one funding program that's happening through our agency with the federal coronavirus relief funds that have passed through for our ability to pass those funds along to agriculture businesses. But this conversation is specifically about the first application that is already open, which is for dairy producers and dairy processors. So with that, today we're going to talk a little bit just briefly about the legislation that led us to this point. We'll discuss eligibility for those businesses who meet certain criteria in order to complete an application. We'll talk about the overall timeline for this program and for the application process. We will also get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty in the application itself, and we'll share resources and contact information for those who are interested in applying. And again, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So welcome to our other agency staff who are on the call. We have our lovely Terry Smith and Faith Raymond, Diane Bothfeld, Lauren Masseria, Abby Willard, and maybe some others who I'm missing. So thanks everyone for joining, and they are going to be standing by to help answer questions at the end. This link at the bottom of the slide is where we will have a recorded version of the webinar available for viewing at a later time. So that won't be posted right away, but we will have it available after our webinar series. So this is the one and only webinar for dairy industry organizations, but we do have two other webinars, one tomorrow and one Thursday for dairy farmers and processors. And so more than likely that one of those recordings will be made available at this link, as well as the PowerPoint for your reference. So that is forthcoming in the next several days. Here are our lovely state of Vermont partners who are involved in this payment program: ourselves, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Department of Taxes, and Department of Finance and Management. Everyone plays a unique role, and everyone has worked hard to get to this point where the application is live and we are accepting and supporting applicants moving forward. So I wanted to recognize that everyone has played a pivotal role in getting to this point, and will continue to do that. So just a note on the legislation. Act 138 was signed by Governor Scott earlier this month on July 2nd, which established VCAP, or the Vermont COVID-19 Agriculture Assistance Program. And as I mentioned, that program refers to all of the funds that will be made available for agriculture businesses, but specifically $25 million of that is carved out and specifically available for dairy farmers and dairy processors based in Vermont. So we feel very lucky for that. And the funds are available specifically for market losses and expenses caused by COVID-19 related business disruptions. So this isn't just for any old thing happening or for something that was in the works before COVID hit in March of this year, but specifically for the losses and costs that businesses have incurred in relation to the pandemic. The dairy assistance application opened this past Friday, the 17th, and will be available through Thursday, October 1st. We'll talk a little bit later about details of the application. That's just a quick overview. So here we have the program timeline for the VCAP application, and the non-dairy and other components of this program are still in development. For those of you who haven't been privy to those conversations, dairy is the first release of a VCAP application. So as we know, the legislation was just enacted earlier this month, and Governor Scott and Secretary Tebbetts announced this information at a press conference just about a week ago. The application for dairy is open. The others, after they are developed, will be open within a month or so. Application review and decisions will continue throughout the summer and early fall into mid-fall, depending on the timeline as it gets firmed up. Agriculture application periods altogether will close out in the late fall, mid to late fall, and then payments will be issued to those that are approved gradually from late July onward until that point. So the Department of Finance and Management is going to be issuing payments, and we'll have a little bit more detail about that coming up. So here we have eligibility for dairy assistance funding, which we're talking about today. So this application is specifically for dairy producers and or dairy processors. So if businesses are one or the other or both, this applies to them, and you have the official definitions here, as well as a business that's currently in businesses that are currently in good standing with the state of Vermont. So no active violations at this time. Further eligibility, dairy producers must be currently producing milk, or if they are not, they should have been producing milk right before the emergence of COVID-19 on March 1st of this year. And if they cease production, they attest to having a good faith plan to restart milk production or operation through producing another commodity. So that's a special scenario that we certainly acknowledge. Dairy processors must be producing dairy products at this time, at the time they submit the application between now and October 1st. And whether or not businesses are producers, processors, or both, they must be able to demonstrate the economic harm that occurred to their business after March 1st and up until the time they're submitting the application this year. And that relates to lost revenue and expenses that have occurred, again, in direct relation to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And documentation for all of those things and all of the losses and costs that are referenced in the application must be clearly documented in the upload sections, which we'll talk about. So one point of potential confusion is that anyone applying for this grant cannot be a recipient of another state grant that is funded using the federal coronavirus relief funds. So essentially that means anyone who has already applied for or received a Vermont economic recovery grant through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development would not be eligible to apply. And we know many businesses are in a scenario where they're waiting to see what other funding opportunities become available, especially through our agency with the non-dairy and Working Lands Enterprise Initiative funding opportunities that are coming through. So this would apply especially to businesses that have multiple operations. We certainly can't advise businesses on which funding opportunity is best through the state, but we can tell you that if you receive one, then you cannot receive the other as a business. So this specifically applies to state grants. Federal grants are another scenario, and we know that many businesses have received those grants that don't prohibit you from applying to this opportunity. Eligible losses and expenses under the dairy assistance application are, again, anything that's related explicitly to COVID-19 and the events that have happened within businesses as a result. So multiple causes for loss in revenue, and that can be different based on whether you're a farmer or a processor, based on reduction in sales, milk payment price, reduction in milk production. We certainly understand that this list is not comprehensive and that many businesses encountered costs that they didn't anticipate and maybe we didn't anticipate, but these are just some common examples of those that businesses may have incurred. Product loss, if the product was stored and not able to be sold. Many businesses have made changes in their workplace to accommodate the need to create enhanced safety, social distancing, sanitation. So PPE is certainly a common one, personal protective equipment. Any equipment purchases that have resulted, so a change in production or change in management that required different equipment, including product packaging, supplies, and other is certainly perhaps the biggest category because, as we said, businesses all have their own track and own needs depending on how they responded and are still responding to the pandemic. And so we know that there will be quite a few that will fall in the other losses and expenses category. So if an applicant has received federal aid related to COVID-19 relief, that doesn't mean they can't can't submit an application here, but what it does mean is that if a certain loss or expense has already been covered through a federal funding program such as PPP, EIDL, others, that means that that same cost cannot be applied for in this application. So, you know, many businesses may have received partial funding for the items that they submitted in a federal application. So we understand that there are those scenarios, and the outstanding costs that were not funded through federal aid can certainly be submitted here. We also know that people are still awaiting some decisions, and so the consensus is that if a certain cost or loss was applied for within another COVID relief application of any kind, that for reasons of precaution, just to not include it within this application. And then the caveat there is that a second application is able to be submitted for any business anytime before the deadline. So for example, the application is live now. If a business knows they have hard costs that they can document and are ready to go, they can begin an application, upload that documentation and submit. And maybe they're waiting on several other funding decisions and are encountering even more costs between now and October 1st. And in that case, keeping documentation of those items, they can then submit a second application anytime before October 1st to cover those remaining costs. And there's a maximum of 2 applications submitted per business. So that's something to consider for everyone. Here are a few considerations from a tax perspective. So non-dairy losses and expenses can be included in this application in the event that they are related to the business. So many dairy businesses have other operations that are happening under the same tax ID number. And in that case, because they're still related to their operation and related to COVID-19, they can be included for consideration. This does mean that those non-dairy costs, you know, because they're under the same business, cannot then be applied for in another application for a state opportunity. However, losses or expenses, say if a dairy business is also operating a sugaring business under another tax ID number, it may be the same business owner, but because it's a legally separate entity, those costs can then not be included in that application. But the benefit to that is because it's a separate business operating on its own, that business could then apply for a different grant, and each tax ID number would then have its own funding opportunity. Payments under this program are considered taxable income. That's different from the usual grants that we administer from some of the grants we administer from our agency. So that's something to make note of, and recipients should expect to receive a Form 1099-G that will explain that will detail the award amount to claim for taxes for the 2020 tax year. here are the funding caps dependent on the type of business that's operating. So a milk producer that is a small farm can apply for up to $18,300. For a certified small farm, $34,300. Medium farm operations, maximum $56,000, and large farm operations up to $100,000. So this means the collective amount that you can apply for, if you choose to apply more than once, if you do the maximum of 2 applications, the cap that you can receive is listed here depending on your business type. So if you, and we do understand that many folks would max out and they would hit their funding cap immediately in the first application and have acquired many more costs than this cap, which is understandable. And then there's some others who may not reach this cap at any point, or some who may not be close, but then submit a second application that allows them to reach that cap. Dairy processors, if depends on the amount of milk that's processed, so less than 500 pounds is up to $31,000, 500 to 9,999, up to 40,000, between 10,000 and 49,999 is up to a $50,000 payment, and more than 50,000 pounds of milk is up to a $60,000 payment. So again, if you are a producer processor, then your cap would be respective to the type of business that you have. And we'll talk a little bit about the application process depending on your business type moving forward. So here we have the timeline that is specific to the funding application for producers and processors. As we know, the information is out in the open and the application is live as of last Friday. We had a webinar earlier today and we'll have 2 more tomorrow, Wednesday the 22nd at 12:30 and this Thursday the 23rd at 3:30. So please share this information with anyone you believe it would be helpful for. We will have the recorded webinar available online, but it is nice to be able to have the live interaction and ability to have questions answered in real time. So we hope everyone can join who's interested in applying. The deadline is October 1st for all applications from dairy businesses. Applications will be reviewed in the order that they're received between this time and the deadline. And those that are approved for funding will be, their payment amounts will be processed by Department of Finance and Management. And typically we're allowing 1 to 2 weeks for the internal review process. Applications will be received and reviewed by Agency of Agriculture staff within 1 to 2 weeks of submission, and then payments are issued for those that are approved within 2 to 3 weeks. So at this time, while the review process is still being firmed up, we're allowing 3 to 5 weeks from the time of application submission to the time that payments will be received. And payments will be issued not by direct deposit, only by live check that will be sent through US mail. So now we will transition a little bit to talking about the application itself, and we'll talk about the process, and then we'll get into some of the more technical details moving forward. We know that it's complicated to submit any type of application online, and this is no exception. And we, want to be clear that we're available for support throughout the application cycle. Online is the only method that applications are being accepted, so there is no paper application option. So certainly we hope that the resources we provide will be helpful during the process, and we will do our best to answer questions as they're received and post the responses so that folks can learn from each other and as the application timeline continues. So step 1, producers and processors should have received a letter from Agency of Agriculture within the last week, starting the week of July 13th, and we certainly recommend reading the full contents. That letter, which should have come by mail or email, would have contained each business's unique dairy ID, and that's a critical piece of information for them to have because that allows them to begin an online application. So if a business has not received that letter or their unique ID, then please contact the agency so we can look into that. All the documentation that's needed for the application is something we recommend collecting beforehand because the application itself requires, as we said, a handful of uploads, and it's much easier to read everything you need to read, collect everything you need to upload, have it all in one place, and then go ahead and access the application online. So searching for a business, searching for their own business in the application system using that unique ID number will be the first step, and we will have a screenshot of what that will look like coming up. So business registration, and then after registration is complete in that system, it will open up an application to begin, complete, and submit. There is a review period or a review screen where you're able to look at all of the application content and confirm it before you submit. And then at that point, it turns over to the agency and application review begins. So again, 1 to 2 weeks will be the review time period. There may be applications that need corrections or adjustments, in which case we'll be in touch. Applications will be approved or denied or partially approved. So that's something to note, that if a cost is entered into the application but it's not eligible, that doesn't mean the application will be thrown out. It just means that that certain cost or loss will not be approved for funding, and the rest of the application and payment can be approved if it is eligible. So it's not 100% approval or denial. It can be a partial payment based on what's eligible. And then payments that are approved will be mailed from Department of Finance and Management. So the documents we mentioned that are needed to complete an application, first and foremost, that unique dairy ID number that has arrived by mail or email last week, a completed W-9 form, which hopefully the majority of folks have already mailed to the agency. And if not, then that will need to be uploaded within the application itself. And there are a host of guidelines around correctly completing it. Documentation of other aid applied for or received. So there are a handful of examples here, and that's so we can confirm that other costs have not been paid for, and that we're aware of the whole picture for the business that's applying. Documentation of all the expenses that you plan to submit. So we know that many businesses have a lot of costs and a lot of losses that have happened since March 1st. The key will be having clear documentation of each one of those items, receipts, invoices, and there'll be other examples coming up that will need to substantiate each of the items that are requested. So and really that also allows an application to be expedited. So if we have an application that's submitted that doesn't have accurate documentation or has missing documentation, it will then need to be corrected and moved to the back of the queue, or that cost just will not be approved. And so in order for everyone to move through the process most quickly and efficiently and get all the funds they deserve, having that clear and concise documentation will be really important. And so for producers, that will include milk checks, for processors, volume of milk, and manufactured and sales month to month. We'll get into that in future slides, so I won't get too far into it yet. So there are some unique scenarios based on the type of business that's applying. So for each unique dairy ID, a business will fill out their own application. So if you're just a producer, that's your one and only, then that's your one and only application opportunity. Again, each business can submit a second application, but still under the same dairy ID number. So if you are a producer processor, you have multiple locations, you then would have been issued 2 unique dairy ID numbers, in which case you would submit 2 unique applications, 1 for each ID number. The exception is large farm operations and medium farm operations that have multiple locations under the same permit. And in that case, you would submit 1 application for your 1 dairy ID number. So we mentioned the importance of the completed W-9. If the agency did not receive that, we would not have been able to pre-populate your information in the system, and that means you'll need to manually populate it and upload your W-9 within the application. However, even if you did send a W-9, if it was incomplete or incorrect, then you will need to enter any field that is missing or needs correcting, and you will still need to upload a completed W-9. So the goal is for your W-9 to match the information that you put in the application exactly. So that will need to be considered moving forward. For successful applicants, one thing to note is kind of a funny thing is that Internet Explorer doesn't allow the application to function correctly. So please use any up-to-date internet browser like Firefox or Chrome and steer clear of Internet Explorer. Applications will save once full pages are complete. So at any point after registration and an application is begun, it will always live there. However, if you're in the middle of a page and decide to walk away and make lunch, it's likely that if your page times out, that you will lose that data. So a recommendation is, we know that businesses likely will not be completing their application all in one sitting. So before they walk away, make sure to complete a full page and proceed to the next page, and then that data will be preserved. Once an application is submitted, it can't be edited. So again, there is that there, you can edit it at any point after you've created an application up until the deadline, but once submission has happened, it cannot be revisited. Here are resources for those who are interested in applying, and for the agency at this point, we've sort of corralled them all onto this web page, which is VCAP, but information specifically for dairy applicants. So you'll find when you visit this page, the dairy applicant information sheet, which many folks have already seen, and it's a quick resource with an overview of the program and some basic information for everyone to know. For those interested in applying, the application guide is actually a new step-by-step resource that for those who are opening an application, having the application guide open at the same time could be helpful to help navigate within the application and explain what's being asked for, and just to know where to click on the screen. So I would highly recommend for those who are going to apply to use the application guide just to help navigate the system. This webpage also has a direct link to the W-9 form and instructions for filling it out. Responses to the questions that we are asked by applicants that we will post after the webinar series will be uploaded here as well, along with the recording of the producer processor applicant webinar and materials. So this is sort of your all-purpose informational webpage for applicants. So take a breath. Thanks everyone for listening to all the lead up and the laying of the foundation. And we do have a discussion now of the application itself. So as we mentioned, it's an online only application. It's something that takes time. I may not have mentioned yet, this is not a first come, first serve funding opportunity as many of the other COVID funding opportunities are. So for those who are applying, certainly consider that this is something that should be done thoroughly and accurately, and there are funds available for each producer and processor, and getting it submitted in a proper way will save everyone time and energy and get to everyone's end goal more efficiently. So certainly take the time that's needed to do that. And this is the link that takes you directly to the registration page. So the registration is a one-time action, meaning once a business registers and starts an application, that at any point they can revisit the application, but the registration has to be completed in order to do that. So after visiting this link, there will be a letter here starting with Dear Dairy Farmer or Dairy Processor. So we recommend fully reading through that note, and then there is an acknowledgement at the bottom of the form that says, I understand and recognize all these terms, as well as the first eligibility question about producing milk or products as of March 1st. And assuming that eligibility is met, then below will pop up this simple registration form. And that's the first place where an applicant will need to enter their unique ID number that they received in the letter or email that we mentioned from the agency. When that happens and the ID number is correctly entered in this box circled in orange, then the business name will automatically populate under the company box. If the number is entered incorrectly and it doesn't pop up, or if the number is entered correctly and for some reason it still doesn't pop up, then certainly we would need to know. So please have an applicant inform us if there are any technical issues there. There's a checkbox if an applicant is working with a technical assistance provider and that person is submitting the application on their behalf. So if they're working together and the applicant is still submitting it on their own, that's fine, and you don't need to check the box, but please check the box if for some reason the technical assistance provider is the one who is submitting on their behalf. And then the user registration form is very simple below. I will note that the username that's created as a result of the registration is automatically your email address. So the applicant's email address should be the one that they are planning to check frequently, because it will be the one receiving all the communications about the status of the application. So that will automatically be the username. The password when an applicant is creating it should be a minimum of 10 characters with one special character, one number, and that's detailed in the application guide also. So it's a secure password. And that will be the first step of the application. Once that is complete, once the business registration is complete, then a new application can be started. So clicking the top right button to start a new application will open this menu of application options. The first option will say dairy processor plant application. The second will be dairy producer farm application. And so click on the one that applies to the applicant. There can be 2 simultaneous live applications if you are a producer and a processor. So after the registration has been completed, then what opens up is sort of the home page, navigational page for the application itself. So here we have sort of a navigational menu that shows you where you are within the application. The number 1 is highlighted because we are on the applicant information screen. The unique dairy ID number will be entered a second time. And this is where that pre-populated W-9 information will come into play. So once the ID is entered, the business legal name and address and all the other tax information should auto-populate here. There are some optional fields to search for a NAICS code, as well as check if it's minority, veteran, or women-owned business. After these optional fields, all of the tax-related information needs to be double-checked and confirmed that it's accurate. If it is not, or if there's anything missing, that will need to be filled in or corrected, and then a current and correct W-9 will need to be uploaded at the bottom of this section, and all of that needs to be completed before the rest of the application is edited. So here's where we have a little bit of divergence between the producer and the processor application. So the producer application asks for milk pay price in January 2020, and as well as the price and volume of milk from the months that are shown below. And so what happens here is that an applicant checks the box associated with the month, enters the price, pounds of milk, and then uploads a milk check showing and confirming that price. So that's something that is unique to producers and is needed to do a price comparison for COVID-19 reasons. So again, we recommend having the milk check for each month ready to be able to upload, and then a question at the bottom about if you have received CFAP funding as well. The next slide here we have is documentation that applies to a processor. So in this case, a processor will be asked to upload evidence of the amount of manufactured volume of milk for the months that are mentioned or the most recent records. And so we're talking about make sheets, profit and loss. There's a variety of documentation that's allowable here. And this is, again, a 2019-2020 comparison. So each of the months will have an upload button. A note on any upload feature within the application is that the upload button will allow you to then browse your computer files and select something from within your desktop or your files, or drag and drop is also an option to click, hold, and move a document from the computer right into the application itself. The next slide for processor again is regarding sales changes from year to year in processed product. So we're looking at pre-COVID and post-COVID sales and documentation that supports that change. And then after that information is entered and documentation is uploaded for all of the months that apply, then having a text explanation at the bottom of how and why the change in sales occurred of the processed product. So then the next part of the application, which is perhaps the largest, or at least for many applicants will take the largest amount of time, is other economic harm. And so this relates to essentially everything that's not the milk price or the product sales. We're talking about business changes, expenses, pretty much everything else falls under this economic harm category. And we do encourage folks to add anything that they think is relevant here. There is a long list which is not shown in this slide that has checkboxes for, yes, this cost or loss does apply to me. So right here at the bottom, you see personal protective equipment is just one of probably 10 or 12 examples that are in this section of the application, where if that applies to the business, they check that box and then have the option to, or the requirement to enter the price of whatever that economic harm item was. They then will have to upload documentation that shows proof of purchase or loss of that particular economic harm item and a reason that it was incurred, and then a required explanation at the bottom of what the loss or expense was in a little more elaboration. So again, there are some pre-populated options here: PPE, packaging, workplace changes, equipment, what have you. And then there are a handful of additional cost/loss options where anything that's not already mentioned can be listed. So again, if there's question, we recommend including an item if the business believes that that's something eligible and directly related to COVID-19. The worst that can happen is that it wouldn't be approved. But anything that's not already covered by a federal aid program and relates to the pandemic will be considered. So again, having that documentation on hand is helpful when the application is begun. We recommend including everything in a PDF if possible. And the application actually won't let you proceed unless you have the documentation uploaded. So having everything together at the beginning will be helpful. So those were steps 1 through 4 of the application. This then takes you to step 5, which is the review capability, and that allows you, this is just the top of the page, that allows you to see the full application at one time and all the content that's been entered. So it's highly recommended to read all of it carefully and double and triple check that everything is complete and accurate. And if it is, you can click next. Anything that needs to be edited, you can click back to go to the previous page or back to dashboard to restart the application from the beginning, just to make sure, again, that everything appears as it should. All the correct documentation is in the right place. Once that review is completed, then you go to step 6, which is the certification. And the first thing that happens here is that the business will select areas that they'd like to receive any technical assistance. At least one is required, and you do that by selecting it, clicking the right-facing arrow. Then once the selected field has one or more technical assistance categories populated, you can move on to the actual certification. And what we mean by certification is all of these statements that have checkboxes that need to be read and acknowledged individually in order to submit an application. So this is some important legal language that needs to be reviewed and acknowledged with a checkbox for each. That is the second to last step to submitting an application. And after that is the e-signature. So after attesting to agreeing and acknowledging all of these statements, typing the applicant's signature will constitute the legal electronic signature, and the date will automatically populate. Today's date will automatically populate. Then the submit button can be clicked and everyone will cheer, and that is the last step. So a confirmation screen at that point will pop up. There's an application confirmation number to make note of, as well as follow-up contact options if they're needed. And at that point, you can click out of the browser, or if you click finish, it will take you back to your dashboard where you can then view the application in its completed status. So it's then been submitted and can't be re-edited, but it can be viewed at any point. And then if you are a producer processor and have multiple applications that are active, then the dashboard will contain all of them together. So here we have our support contacts that we mentioned. The automated chat feature that lives on the VCAP webpage is what is certainly the first line that we recommend reaching out to for assistance. So it allows someone to submit a question and it will populate with answers. So if for some reason the response is not complete or satisfactory or doesn't fully answer the question that you have, then feel free to take advantage of the agency's COVID response email address or the helpline that's designated specifically for this program. And those are both listed here. So the agency is able to provide program information and support, answer questions about unique business scenarios, provide missing business IDs, whatever it may be. However, if a business needs direct assistance with submitting an application or completing it because they are not at the point where they're feeling ready or savvy to do that, or have trouble accessing it online, or whatever the reason may be, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board does have business advisors under the Farm Viability Program that have agreed to be available just for that type of assistance. So we have Mariah Knopf's information here, email and phone number to reach out to for her, and a business advisor can be designated for that reason. So take advantage for anyone who may need that. Here is just a reminder of the agency's homepage of our website. It's just a good reminder that even though this is a big point of interaction for many business owners right now, this program, that we do have a lot of other things going on, and that we post press releases and upcoming events and up-to-date information about COVID-19 relief and other resources for businesses and business development, all within our website. So please take a visit every now and then to stay tuned about what is going on within the agency. We really like to have that interactive component with folks around the state as much as we can. And at this point, that is our formal presentation, and we'd like to, in the remaining 12 minutes, open up for questions. And I know probably folks are either maybe have already raised them or are thinking of those questions. And so please go ahead and enter in the chat box. We do have other staff here who are able to assist with that. And